Ready, Barbara?
I am.
Okay. All right, we are live.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to spend a little time here with Brian Freeman, one of the most versatile authors that I know. I just love the fact that he's constantly surprising me with new and different books. And last year, he wrote a fabulous book called In the Deep, Deep Snow, which was nominated for an Edgar. And now he has written, I guess we could call it a prequel, The Story Before the Story.
It's a prequel and it's a follow-up. I'm kind of throwing a few curveballs with that. So,
well, that's very, very true. Right. So Brian thoughtfully stepped out into a blizzard because he lives in Duluth or thereabouts in northern Minnesota to send me my advanced reading copy, and our autographed copies have not yet arrived from the publisher. But here's your moment to go ahead, and Patrick will put a link in the comments field, and you can. Oh, look, there's a real book. Yay. And anyway, you can click on the link when Patrick enters it and order a book, or just go to our web store at poisonedpen.com and order your autographed copy. And if you missed In the Deep, Deep Snow, I can't recommend it enough. It was just a sensational book. So Brian, you've been writing Ludlum, you've been writing Jonathan Stride. What's with this particular sequence here?
yeah, the Deep, Deep Snow and the Ursulina, they kind of fit. They both stand on their own, and yet they fit together hand in glove. And they started, both of them, as audiobook originals, and I think that has a little bit of an impact on how I approached the storytelling. Both books are written in first person, both told from a female heroine's perspective, and having them start as audiobooks, I think I was very much in the mindset of how the narrator would tell the story, and I think that flows through then into how the first person works in the narration, and it gives something extra to the storytelling that I really like. Readers have been asking me for years, kind of what's my favorite book, and that's always been hard to say, because it's like picking your favorite child. But there is something about the Ursulina and the Deep, Deep Snow. Those two books are very, very special to me.
Well, I knew they were. Otherwise, you wouldn't have stepped out into a blizzard to send me a copy of it. Why, when you say they started as audiobooks, were they commissioned specifically as audio, and then you decided to make them novels? So were they a two-part deal or what?
It was a two-part deal. Yeah, they started as audio originals, and then we worked with Blackstone on the physical editions of both books. And as I say, I think that just gives it adds a little extra dimension to the nature of the storytelling, because when you think about the story, you have to start by thinking about how is it going to sound to the reader. And I think even when you get to physical editions, I think some of that still then carries through.
Well, I don't doubt that. Did you expand the book for the print edition?
Nope, they are word for word exactly the same.
Wow, how very cool. Okay, so but let's go to a larger question, which is, why did you decide to write In the Deep, Deep Snow, since that one came first?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like you have nothing else to do. You're writing the Ludlum series. When was the last Jonathan Stride out?
The last Jonathan Stride was Funeral for a Friend, which was fall of 2020, and Stride will be back November 1st in the Zero Night. So Stride's going to be returning this year, but he took a little holiday last year while I was working on other projects. So
okay.
and the Deep, Deep Snow, that book, I had actually had the story concept in my head for quite a few years. It was actually the inspiration for it came from a terrible true crime in Minnesota that had happened some 20 odd years ago, and it involved the disappearance of a young boy, much like the Deep, Deep Snow did. But I had two goals in writing the Deep, Deep Snow. I wanted to be able to create a story that would actually provide some sense of closure and justice a story that at the time had no closure and justice in Minnesota. After I wrote the book, the crime sadly was solved in a very terrible way. But that was the second part of it. Was I wanted to use that inspiration and that terrible situation to write a book where there was really no violence and no bad people. There were just kind of good intentions gone astray, and that was really the heart of the Deep Snow. That really there are no bad people in that book. They're just people that have made some terrible mistakes that ripple through the entire storyline.
Was part of the attraction to set it. I mean, you live in Minnesota. And even though climate change is still going on, there's still winter in Minnesota, right? I mean, what's the temperature there right now?
Yeah, I think it's probably in the teens right now. Tomorrow, the high is only supposed to be about 2, I believe. So, in Minnesota, they used to have bumper stickers that saying, Minnesotans for global warming.
No, I didn't know that, but I could easily believe it. I mean, I grew up in Chicago, and when the wind would come off Lake Michigan in the winter, I mean, I remember my elementary school having to close for 2 weeks because the temperatures were -20 and below that. And the furnace, the heat system could not keep up.
Yeah. It's interesting. I didn't realize you grew up in Chicago. I actually grew up in Chicago as well. So.
Well, I grew up in Winnetka, which is north of Chicago, on Lake Michigan, which meant that we were indeed subject to some dramatic weather changes because the lake.
Yeah, they don't call it the Windy City for nothing. That's for sure.
No, it was very volatile. So anyway, I mean, I can remember what really serious cold would be. And the Jonathan Strides are set in Duluth, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and the Stride series, that's my longest running series. Zero Night will be the 11th book in the Stride series, and it's always interesting tackling standalones versus shorter series versus going back to Stride, because Stride he's been around so long for me that he feels like an old friend, and he was where I first broke through. My first 5 books were all Stride novels, and so I've really enjoyed seeing Stride evolve as a hero over the years. The Stride that you meet in Funeral for a Friend is a very different man than he was in my very first book, Immoral, because of all the things that have happened to him over the years. But I think that's what keeps a series fresh is the evolution of the characters. When I was chatting with Tom Colgan at Putnam about the Jason Bourne series, I said that I thought that in general, series don't go astray on plots. They go astray on characters, that ultimately it's the characters that get stale. And so I think that's the key to keeping a series fresh, is you really have to have your characters continuing to grow and change and evolve. And if you do that, then the series is going to feel vibrant to the readers.
Well, it's not just Stride. I mean, you have an auxiliary cast, including, I'm trying to remember her name. What's her name?
Serena and Maggie are the 2 detectives that work with Stride. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, they've all changed and evolved. And taking up the Ludlum, and you have a new one coming out in July, correct?
Yes. Yep. That's right.
Which we'll be talking about in July. What's the title of the July one?
The Born Sacrifice.
Ooh, The Born Sacrifice. Love that. So, having written the Strides, and what interested you in taking up the Ludlum franchise?
That was such a fun opportunity, and I mean, part of it is simply the fact that I love a creative challenge, and I hate sort of doing the same thing twice. I always love to be able to break new ground and explore new challenges, and so the idea of breathing new life into such an iconic series really sounded like a terrific, exciting, fun, creative opportunity for me. And I'd been a Ludlum fan my whole life, so The Born Identity was one of my favorite books growing up as a teenager. So I just really enjoyed the opportunity to take 40 years worth of history for this character and find kind of a new way to make Bourne relevant and fresh in the modern era.
I think it's fascinating, to update these characters that have been around for so long. We just did an event with Ace Atkins for his 10th, Robert Parker Spencer's 10th and last one. And then somebody else is taking up the Spencers. But it's the 50th Spencer. Wow, talk about a lot of history.
Yeah,
And I know from talking to you and talking to Ace and talking to other people who've worked in franchises like the Clancy franchise, for example,
sure.
that it's an interesting challenge to take a character that's iconic, that's been around for a long time, and that somebody else created, not only that character, but that character's universe, and then doing something with it that makes sense for the moment without losing
Yes.
the things that made that character iconic in the first place.
Right. That's exactly the balancing act. And in some ways, that's why for me, the second Bourne novel, The Bourne Treachery, was in some ways harder than the first one, because I wrote The Bourne Evolution kind of seeing it as, a tribute to Ludlum and resurrecting the Bourne character. But going on to the next one, I felt that was when I needed to really start making Bourne my own character and really letting the character evolve and change and grow. And you sort of need to give yourself permission to do that, which is a very different feeling. And once I kind of crossed that threshold, then it all seemed to flow.
Right. Well, you have to be respectful and creative all at the
Yes.
same time. For those of you who, I'm digressing here, but we'll come back to the Ursulina, I promise. For those of you who wonder why some of these universes created by other authors continue, and why many of them do not, is that it's a decision made by the author or by the author's family while the author is still around. I mean, what happens is you create a literary estate, and smart authors, I'm saying this to authors, some of you are watching this, smart authors actually do create a literary estate with the benefit of an attorney, and it has an administrator, and that estate is what then works with the publisher to carry on the work. In other words, the publisher can't just say, God, I really like publishing those, love them characters, so I think we'll just do more. It doesn't work that way. So you have to have the literary estate of the author, and you have to have a publisher who's interested in it, and they have to come together, and together they then hire somebody like Brian to continue the work, and it's up to them who it is and how long that person might stay in it. Or in Ace's case, maybe he, I didn't ask him, decided that 10 books was enough. But anyway, many of you may have wondered why, okay, I really love, this set of books, but they seem to have gone away with the author. Whereas this one, and how long has it been since there was a Bourne book? I mean,
I think the Bourne Ultimatum was somewhere around 1990, so
pretty long time.
Yep.
And do you know, I mean, was it, obviously it has to be the literary estate. Did somebody come along in the Ludlum family or heirs or institution or whatever he left his literary estate to and say, gee, it'd be a good idea?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, for several years, Eric von Lustbader did Bourne novels.
Right.
And then they switched from Grand Central over to Putnam with a new deal, and they kind of wanted to reboot the Bourne series, and that was when I came into the mix. So,
and copyright's an interesting thing because it doesn't go on forever, and there was a discrepancy between the American and the British view of the Sherlock Holmes copyright. For example, the Conan Doyle estate, it lasted longer in the UK than it did here in the US. So any of you who read Laurie King's Mary Russell and Sherlock Holmes series, it couldn't be published in the UK when it was first published in America because of these copyright issues and so forth. And there's I think a charity or a foundation or something that the royalties earned by Sherlock Holmes supports. So there's so many variations on this. It's a really fascinating subject, but I always think it's very cool when somebody, like you, who really likes a franchise, decides that they're going to see what they can do with it.
Yeah, it has really been a great opportunity. I've loved the whole experience. It's really been a lot of fun.
Has it changed your writing?
Yeah, I think it has. I think there's a little bit more of Ludlum creeping into my books. I can feel it in the adrenaline of the storytelling. I think he's kind of reaching out and grabbing hold of me even when I'm doing my own books now. So we're kind of meeting in the middle sometimes.
I love that. How wonderful. Sort of like really a ghost or a voice from the
That
past.
absolutely.
So I have to say that the Ursulina is fairly propulsive. So, well, it is propulsive. So I didn't ask that question idly. Why do you call this book the Ursulina?
Yeah, that's I love the title. I hope readers will embrace it because, of course, it's rather a mysterious title. But when I was writing The Deep, Deep Snow, a thread throughout the plot of The Deep, Deep Snow evolves out of this myth or legend in the remote wilderness area where Shelby Lake is of this Bigfoot-like creature that stalks the forest. And in some places, it's called Bigfoot, in some places Sasquatch, in some places the Yeti. Well, in Shelby Lake's world, they call it the Ursulina. And it's funny how the spontaneity of creativity comes into play, because when I first plotted out The Deep, Deep Snow, I didn't have anything about this mythical creature kind of overlaying the plot. It really wasn't until I was writing the prologue of The Deep, Deep Snow and I was talking about how Shelby had been abandoned as a baby on a doorstep right near the forest, and I was talking about the creatures that could have harmed this little baby there, and I talked about the wolverines and the wolves and the other animals in the forest. And as I was writing it, I suddenly thought, yeah, this is the kind of area where they would probably have this kind of myth or legend of this strange beast out there. And so I threw in this mythical beast, the Ursulina. And then as The Deep, Deep Snow carried on, the story of this beast and how it kind of becomes a central part of the ethos or the culture of the area just sort of expanded in the plot and began to take a very significant role in the storytelling. And so when I started thinking about a follow-up book to The Deep, Deep Snow, I could have just done a straight follow-up and done another Shelby Lake story, but The Deep, Deep Snow kind of leaves open an important question about Shelby's background in terms of why she was abandoned as a baby and who was her mother and what happened. And so as I thought about it, I thought that it would be far more compelling and dramatic to really kind of go back and write a novel that focused on not Shelby herself, but on Shelby's mother, and that really told her story. And so that's what I decided to do in the follow-up book. So the follow-up book in some ways became a prequel to The Deep, Deep Snow. And I decided to put this legend, this myth of the Ursulina at the heart of the story. And so Rebecca Calder, like Shelby, is a young sheriff's deputy, and there's this series of killings going on in this remote area where a killer has taken on the identity of this mythical beast, and so leaves behind these taunting messages on the wall. I am the Ursulina, and so that's really the heart of the story.
So basically, it's a serial killer.
Well, is it?
Maybe. Maybe not. Ursus is Latin for bear.
Exactly.
So, the Ursulina kind of implies, the sort of giant grizzly or, similar kind of bear creature up there in the woods somewhere.
Exactly why I chose that name.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it makes perfectly good sense. I mean, there are few things more terrifying to most people than to think about a grizzly. As my friend Dana Stabenow, who's watching television with my husband at the moment, hiding out for winter in Alaska, will say that, death by Alaska often involves a grizzly.
This is true.
So, it seems wonderful. And from what you've said, you are not now precluded from writing at least a trilogy, which is to write about Stacy going forward, unless you feel like you said all you have to say.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I love the character of Shelby. I love the character of Rebecca, and it would certainly be interesting then to do a story that brings the two of them together. And yet there's also a part of me that says that the emotional climax of the Ursulina also kind of feels like just the fitting end for those two characters. So yeah, I haven't decided yet whether I want to go on or whether I feel like those two books kind of are they work together so nicely that would I be disturbing a perfection if I tried to sort of tack on another book to the end. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, you can make up your mind. You don't have to commit to it right away.
Right.
So, you set up the stage in the prologue to in the deep snow. And now here we are in the Ursulina. So tell us about Rebecca, because, she's going to be the focus of this book.
Yeah, Rebecca Calder is the narrator of the Ursulina, and the Ursulina takes place much earlier in time than the Deep Snow. It takes place in the early 1980s, and I love the character of Rebecca. She and I really bonded as writer and heroine. It was a really interesting experience telling her story. You can see, I think, when you read the Ursulina, how she shares certain things in common with Shelby, and yet she's I think sort of a harder edged, darker character than Shelby, and yet she's got a very distinctive narrative voice and a very distinctive story, and so she's got some of that sort of wry irony that you hear from Shelby as well, but there's a little bit more of an edge to it, I think, with Rebecca, and she's had a tougher life in rather a tougher area than Shelby. So I wanted Rebecca to just feel like I knew that this was someone who was going to ultimately face an excruciating, horribly emotional choice at the end of the book. And I think anyone who reads the Deep Snow understands the nature of what has to sort of happen at the end of the book. And for me, in developing the plot, was what could possibly lead someone to make that choice, and that was what was driving everything about the Ursulina. Is how would Rebecca's life, what turns in Rebecca's life would lead her to that excruciating moment, and so the whole plot sort of leads down toward that decision.
So you decided to make both of them in law enforcement. Did you see that it would be more excruciating if they were pursuing careers in law enforcement than if they were lawyers or whatever?
Yeah, I think so, and I kind of just liked the parallelism of the storytelling, that Shelby is a sheriff's deputy and Rebecca's a sheriff's deputy. So right from the get-go, there's that parallelism and commonality between them as heroines, which I think just draws the two stories and the two heroines closer together.
So they're sheriff's deputies, which means that they are not necessarily, but they, in this case, can be in rural areas, because, the general deal is that cities and towns have police departments and counties have sheriff's departments, and sometimes that's contiguous. We're in Maricopa County, so Scottsdale has a police department, Phoenix has a police department, but there is a Maricopa. To our embarrassment, for a long time, there was a Maricopa County sheriff. But there still is, and the sheriff and the police department, they do different things, and occasionally I imagine they work in tandem. Maricopa County is a very, very large territory within which there are cities and police departments. San Francisco, if I remember it, I think it's my friend John Lesquire who pointed this out. San Francisco, I think the city and the county are the same.
I believe that's right. Yeah.
Right. And so therefore, you've got the police department, but, is there an actual sheriff of San Francisco? I can't remember.
I'm not even sure.
You think I know? I went to Stanford. I lived there for a long time, but inherently there could in fact be a sheriff's department. I know that Oakland does have a sheriff's department and sheriff's deputies, because Jesse and Jonathan Kellerman are writing a really interesting series set over in Alameda, I think it is.
Yep.
And Oakland, Berkeley, that whole area, in which we have a sheriff's officer, coroner, whatever it is. So maybe San Francisco does too, but somewhere or other, I never actually think of a San Francisco sheriff. Wow, how interesting. Anyway, because they are sheriff's deputies and not police officers, you can have them out in very rural areas. And oh, wait, here's Patrick saying to me something. The San Francisco Sheriff's Office, Patrick, come out. I lost it. Where'd it go? Hold on here. I have to chat. He's so good about telling me this. The San Francisco Sheriff's Office, officially the city and county of San Francisco. The Sheriff's Office is the Sheriff's Office for the city and county. And the current sheriff is Paul Miyamoto. The department has 850 deputized personnel and support staff. Well, okay, so
Well, there you go.
and you know, they, as I say, they often have very different duties. But what did you decide that the duties of your sheriff's deputies, these two women, are they different than the men's duties? Are they different because they're in rural areas? What?
Well, rural areas, certainly they're out on the country roads and they end up patrolling a kind of a much vaster terrain. And you know, in some of these rural counties in the upper Midwest, you really don't necessarily have any kind of quote unquote cities in the county. Everything is just sort of small towns, and in many cases they're separated by miles. So the sheriff's deputies end up, you know, covering a lot of terrain, and their beats really are these you know, street long towns separated throughout the county.
Well, small towns would have to have a budget that would support a police department, and many of them just don't have enough revenue to
right. Yeah, exactly right. So you know, and Rebecca is you know, here we are back in the early 1980s, you know, in a rural county. Rebecca's the only woman deputy on the force, and the sheriff wasn't particularly happy about having to hire a woman onto the force, and certainly the rest of the team sort of lets her know that she's not especially welcome, and that makes for you know, an additional complication or challenge to her life.
Why did he have to hire her?
Because he was getting a lot of heat from the county board that they needed to have a woman on the team, and so when one of the deputies retired or died, I think it was in the book, he got a lot of pressure to hire someone, and Rebecca was sort of in the right place at the right time, because she was already working as a secretary inside the department, had been answering phones, but dealing with the public in a way that one of her friends was able to sort of, you know, convince the sheriff that he ought to take a chance on her. So,
well, I wondered, you know, I was going to ask you, what kind of training did she have? I mean, did she have like firearms training or martial arts training or any kind of training?
Yeah, firearms training, certainly. I wouldn't think so much martial arts training back then, but you know, she obviously is, you know, she knows that nobody wants her there, and yet Rebecca remembers a poem that her father used to tell her about how she was a little bit bolder, a little bit stronger, and she's always kind of tried to live by that she's not going to let them, you know, push her out. She's going to try to make it work. So.
Right. So she has a lot of burdens to bear. I mean, it's hard for her to do her job, and frequently the biggest problem are her fellow officers. Is it easier for her daughter?
Yeah, and her husband, and so and one thing I actually drew in, and you know, years ago I used to work for a law firm in Minneapolis that was involved in the nation's first sexual harassment class action lawsuit involving a case up in rural Minnesota, and I sort of drew on that in setting in place a sexual harassment lawsuit involving a mine up in Rebecca's area, and so that again kind of overlays the plot that there's this dissension going on in the community because of a conflict over this lawsuit being filed. So so that kind of factors into Rebecca's thinking as well.
Have you got any actual personal experience with police departments?
Personal experience myself, other than the research I do know, fortunately neither as a guest of the police or
I realized that sounded like I was asking you if you were a felon, and that's not what I meant. Sorry about that. No, I just meant, had you ever done any ride-alongs or working or anything
Yeah,
within a sheriff's
sure.
department or a police department?
Yeah. I've done ride-alongs with the police up in Duluth, actually, which was it was a fascinating experience, going out with them. I spent the whole day with one of their sergeants, going all over the city, and it taught me a lot, and he was a great guide. So.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, that you want to write about a woman, you want to write back in a different era, and then you want to set her in a place that you've never actually worked. So, is this all a tribute to the writer's imagination?
Well, that's what we do. Yeah. For me, that's what keeps it fun and exciting is inhabiting different worlds. I mean, if all I was doing was inhabiting my own world, I don't think that would be particularly interesting. Most of us writers, at least, if our names aren't Clive Cussler, we lead fairly boring lives. So
True.
So for me, it's fun. It's fun putting myself in the head of completely different heroes. So.
Well, yeah, I can see that. We gave Clive an 80th birthday party in which his family rallied around with photos and sort of clips, and I don't think even I, who'd worked with him for, at that point, 20 years, and then, came up to 30 when he died, had realized just how much he himself did these things.
Oh yeah, extraordinary.
I mean, we have a whole, I still have it on a stick of all of this history of Clive. And he, I love the fact that he actually let that, I mean, we make a lot of John le Carre because he worked briefly, for MI6.
Yeah.
And but that really was just a small part of his life before he began to write. And, he didn't have any enormously, incredibly daring do Ludlum, Jason Bourne kind of, spy adventures. But Clive actually lived much of what he wrote about.
He certainly did. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it was wonderful, which lent a lot of authenticity, I think, to the, and the other thing that was wonderful about Clive is he came from advertising. And so he really did know HX, the foaming cleanser. Any of you know, I can still sing that jingle. Floats the dirt right down the drain. That was Clive. Dorothy Sayers also came from advertising. Talk about two completely different.
Well, yes, and wrote Murder Must Advertise. So that's
right. But I think that that really, Clive understood things like branding and characters, yes. And he was one of the first people to do the author photo. One of the very first, to do the color author photo on the book jacket and so forth. I mean,
and standing next to one of his many vintage cars. That's right.
I'm not sure the first ones do. I've got a copy somewhere of one of his first books, and no, it was just Clive. But anyway, he was a real force of nature, and I truly miss him. But as we said, he did go to a lot of the locations and do a lot of the feats that, I mean, he was 89 when he died, so obviously he wasn't doing them at the bitter end.
Sure.
But for long periods in his life, he was a real action character. So, but for you, what you're saying is you make it up because then you can lead a vicariously interesting life. Is that it?
That's exactly right. Yes.
I love that. Well, why not? And I do like the fact that, that you are not caught up in this current authenticity thing where, you can't write a female character if you're a guy, or you can't, I'm so tired of that. I mean, it's fiction, right. And people have been making stuff up forever. I mean, go back to Dickens, he wrote about Becky Sharp and, whatever. And I hate the fact that people are trying in the interests of some kind of agenda or political correctness to straitjacket authors into being what they write about.
That's utterly insane. I mean, the whole point of being a writer is the imagination you bring to inhabit, other human beings. I mean, it's
absolutely.
that's the creativity of it. If you try to stifle that and say you only should be writing in this narrow channel, well, imagine all of the stories we would have missed if that was the standard we held our authors to.
Well, one piece of advice often given to authors is write what you know, but then other authors that I have talked to say, no, the real object is to write what you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, certainly you're not Jason Bourne, so you're going
Thank
in
God,
that direction.
yes.
But you are, you know, a remarkably prolific writer, Brian. How is it that you feel comfortable and confident to write so many books so quickly?
Yeah,
I would never accuse you of being shallow. None of your books are like that.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. And honestly, if I reached a point where I didn't feel that I could bring that level of substance to each book and do it in the time frame, then I'd change the way I approach things, because I'm never going to put something out that I don't feel, enormously proud of having it out in readers' hands. It's been a crazy few years. I think I've done 3 books a year for the last 3 years.
Something like that. Yep. I can hardly keep up.
It's and I think part of what makes it possible for me, a couple things. One is I've been at this long enough now that I sort of understand, my own process and how it works, and I can be disciplined enough to sort of, create, a creative structure that works for me day by day. But the other thing is, I think what helps is they all are such different stories. If I were doing the same kind of thing, if everything I did was the same straight, police procedural, I think that would be very hard to keep it, fresh in multiple books. But what I love is the fact that I can be working on, the Ursulina and doing this very emotional first person female perspective. And I put that down, and the next one I pick up is this adrenaline propulsive Jason Bourne thriller, and I put that down, and then I pick up Jonathan Stride, and suddenly I'm going to work with an old friend. So that for me is what keeps it really fresh and spontaneous. Is I really have the opportunity to work with such different stories and different heroes, and so that keeps it exciting for me.
What did you do before you became a writer? Let me rephrase that. Yeah. You were probably always a writer, but what did you do in a career before you were able to make a living as a writer?
Yeah, before I broke through, the previous 8 years before Immoral came out, I was actually, of all things, director of marketing and public relations at a big Twin Cities law firm. And so I was sort of taking legal stuff and turning it into taking legalese and turning it into English. And but I learned a lot about storytelling working at the law firm. I remember talking with one of the litigators, and their attitude was, that the person that tells the jury the best story is the one that wins.
That's right.
And so I learned a lot about how to choose what you're emphasizing and how to make sure that you're delivering your message crisply and cleanly and concisely. The lawyers taught me a lot about that. So that was useful experience working for the law firm.
Absolutely. You really do learn structure, and you really do learn narrative and an authentic voice. I was lucky enough to do a lot of litigation, and I can tell you for sure that, sometimes there were actually a couple of trial lawyers I knew who were so good, they would deliberately handicap themselves in front of a jury, and just to see if they could, still manage to bring it off. And they would do that in different and interesting ways. It was back in the 80s when all this was going on. It was still a male dominated profession. Yeah. Most trial attorneys at that time were guys. It's changed a lot. But I really enjoyed the fact that, some of them, in order to keep from being bored, would deliberately handicap themselves before going out to see if they could still win over the jury. There really were some, oftentimes, and you don't apply this to law very often, occasional hilarious results, which not when there was a tragedy involved, but,
Sure.
There's some civil suits. It didn't always have to be criminal suits. There, in civil law, and sometimes some of the results were hilarious to see how it all went. But anyway, so yeah, I can see why that would be great preparation. How many books did you write before you felt like you could write full time?
Yeah, I wrote 5 books that are still sitting in my nightstand drawer, going all the way back to when I was 13, I think it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't remember who it was. Was it Mishner that said you should write about 1 million words before you try to get published? So I think by the time I'd got those 5 books done, I must have been getting pretty close to that. So and it was it was very useful throughout my life because it gave me a chance to sort of cut my teeth and figure out what stories I wanted to tell and the kinds of characters I wanted to create. And so yeah, every now and then I go back and open up the nightstand and pull out one of those old books. And yeah, I pulled out the one I wrote when I was 13 a couple of years ago, and well, that was not bad
You
for a
still
13.
have it?
I do, yeah. It was actually called The Motive, and years later, John Lasqua wrote a book called The Motive. So I wanted to write to John and say, well, I came up with that title first. So.
If you don't want it to be published, you need to remember what I just said earlier about literary estates.
That's right.
That's right. If you just leave it there, some person may come along, and there you would be. Well, you've struck me for a long time as a person who was both in command of and comfortable with your craft. I mean, some writers are not. They're tortured writers, they're all the, but you've never been like that, and all the time I've known you.
Yeah, no, and I think it's partly because of those first 5 books. I mean, when Immoral came out and I got a contract for more books after that, the idea of writing a novel was not intimidating to me. And I think if that had been my actual first novel that was being published, it would have been a lot scarier to think, oh gosh, I have to start writing books for a living. But since I'd already written 5 books in my life, going back to when I was a teenager, writing a novel, well, that's kind of what I do. So it never felt strange. It felt perfectly natural.
So you don't have film rights to the Born series, but
Right.
you just certainly own your own rights to In the Deep, Deep Snow and the Ursulina. Have you seen any kind of film interest in this age of streaming TV where they seem to be looking for content everywhere?
Yeah, actually, the last year we had 2 different projects picked up. My novel Infinite was optioned in like 2 weeks by Universal, and they're really high on it. So they've got the screenplay done. So we're crossing our fingers that they charge ahead with a movie version of Infinite, which would be really exciting. And when I was thinking about the plot concept for Infinite, I actually had given some thought to the idea of doing it as my first screenplay, and I ultimately decided to write it as a novel instead. But I think some of that visual appeal kind of carries through in the book, and I think that's what they picked up on. And then, yeah, The Deep Deep Snow has been optioned for TV as well. We've got a terrific writer director who is very, very high on the project and loves the Ursulina as well. So once again, we'll be crossing our fingers that they can pull that all together, because I think both The Deep Deep Snow and the Ursulina, I mean, that would just make a great streaming series for.
Well, and that's such a difference. They have the advantage of a streaming series where you can really you don't have to cram a whole novel into under 2 hours. I mean, there are novels that I think do better as movies, but so much of it, and particularly if you have any kind of series or continuity, is so much better done with streaming.
It really gives you the opportunity to bring out the nuances of the story and characters in a way that you inevitably sort of have to gloss over if you're trying to fit it into a 2 hour.
I think we're only like 3 days away, I have to look it up, from the first Jack Reacher on television streaming.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And compared to, I need to drop Lee a note, and because we were going to do something, and then he said he was so busy with all the stuff around the premiere.
Sure.
For the launching of the TV, we weren't just us, but with another author, and it didn't work out because Lee really is a wonderful interviewer and has spent a lot of time during COVID talking to other authors. We've done a whole bunch of programs with him, and it's been terrific.
That's great.
But it'll be interesting, having seen one of the Tom Cruise movies, I think it was the first one, to then watch the TV version. And, and it isn't just the new cast, it's the ability to, widen the storytelling and to really go more deeply into a book that will make a difference. I think Connolly did a really interesting thing with Bosch, and I think the Bosch spinoff is coming up here fairly soon as well. But he didn't follow just one book.
Right.
He took bits of different books and created different the same storylines but put together differently. Let me put it that way.
Yes.
Or,
that worked. Yeah, that worked out brilliantly. Yeah.
It worked out really well for him. And, I think there's a lot of choices that if you've got multiple books in a series, there's a lot of choices you can make about whether you want to follow each book or whether you want to take, bits of books and fit them together or however it works out. We'll be talking to CJ Box on March 7th when we launch his new Joe Pickett. And that has been in production up in Calgary, which is like Wyoming, but offers film subsidies. CJ sent me a hilarious picture of himself with his director's chair and just, the whole bit. And so I think he said that they were following the Picketts book to book or something, but I don't want to be quoted on that because I'm not entirely sure, but he's now, I think this is book 21 or 22 or something. So they have a lot of material that they can work with where, you've got the deep snow, and the Ursulina would be, 2 seasons, something like that.
Yep.
But it might inspire you to write a third book. So maybe I should hope.
That's true. Yeah. I think that certainly might impact my decision. So
it might. Absolutely. I think you have more to say about them. So, but I'm not the writer. I'm the reader here. So.
Yeah, well, anytime you really kind of fall in love with the characters, you want there to be more stories about them. So that's certainly the part that appeals to me is about bringing Shelby and Rebecca back. Is that I love both of those heroines, and it would be nice to sort of get inside their lives again.
Yeah, well, a story idea may come to you that won't fit Jonathan Stride and certainly won't fit Jason Bourne, and then you could go, aha. I have these 2 women and maybe I could do something with this. I do think, for a writer like you, where ideas are not an issue, you like fizz over with them, that is more likely that you could do something like that. I mean, some writers really have to strain to get a new idea and write another book, and others like you seem to be able to, do it more easily. I mean, over 32 years, I'd have to go back and look, but there's several authors who've written a book and then that's it.
Yeah, that's true.
There are one book authors, and I've never been entirely sure whether they just don't come up with another idea, whether they said everything they had to say, whether they're intimidated by whatever happened. I mean, I have no idea, what considerations have gone into that, but not every published author ends up writing over time. It just doesn't.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I mean, they always say somewhere deep down, probably everybody has one book in them, but sometimes that's if sometimes they tell that story, and that's kind of what they were meant to do, and
you could get Gone with the Wind or To Kill a Mockingbird, and I mean, there you are. So no reason to ever. I don't know. Margaret Mitchell was killed, so we're never. She died in a car accident, so we'll never know whether she would have written anything before Gone with the Wind.
Right.
I mean, after Gone with the Wind, it kind of became a moot point. Patrick, we probably wandered on here long enough. You want to come join us and contribute to this somewhat erratic discussion? Partly it's erratic because we can't say a lot about the Ursulina without totally spoiling the plot.
That is always the challenge of my books is how do you discuss them without giving away spoilers? So
yeah.
Right. Let's see here. There might be a question or two.
I tried to ask the obvious questions like TV stuff and all.
I think that you may have talked a little bit about this, but Mike says the Ursulina is very much a prequel sequel. So when did Brian get the idea for the let's see. So did Brian get the idea for the Ursulina while writing The Deep Snow? Was it something that you had in mind as you were writing that book?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, honestly, the idea for the Ursulina did not come up until after the Deep Deep Snow was done, and I was talking with actually talking with the folks at Audible about another project for them, and we did so well with the Deep Deep Snow that they wanted they wanted a follow-up book, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the natural follow-up for Shelby's story was not actually focused on Shelby herself, but how Shelby really came into being. And so that was how I loved the idea of trying to figure out what could possibly have led Shelby's mother to the excruciating decision that she made, and understanding that question was what drove the whole plot of the Ursulina. And it's a really delicate balancing act. And obviously, I don't want to say too much about the nature of the book, but it's a prequel and it's also a follow-up, and both of those things are true. So,
was it originally conceived as a full-length novel, or was it a shorter audio?
Nope. It was always conceived as a full-length novel.
Gotcha. Let's see here. Somebody on YouTube, let's see here. Ask him what he's doing next year after 4 books this year, to not feel like he's underperforming. Tell him Edward from Omaha sent the question.
That's a really good question, Brian.
I know Edward from Omaha, and so it does not surprise me in the least that is his question.
You set this high standard for yourself. You got to keep it up, right?
Yeah. It's going to be a busy year because I've got the Ursulina out now. I've got the Born Sacrifice coming out in July. I've got a standalone for Thomas and Mercer called I Remember You. Very unusual plot coming out in August, and then Stride is back in the Zero Night on November 1st. So that's going to be carrying us through 2022. And next year, we'll have to see. I'm going to be writing a 4th Born novel, which we tentatively have titled The Born Defiance. So I expect that to be coming out summer of 2023. I'm under contract for another book for Blackstone. I'm working with Thomas and Mercer on developing a concept for them. So I would expect there'll be a couple more books in addition to Born coming out in 2023. Currently, I know nothing about them yet because I honestly haven't decided what I'm going to write yet. So,
do you feel like you have kind of the latitude to pitch anything you want? I mean, would it have to be in the thriller kind of crime genre, or do you have ambitions to go outside of that at some point and try something else?
Yeah, I could easily see myself going outside that. I mean, I love the thriller genre, and I love kind of pushing the envelope sometimes on the thriller genre. I mean, I have to say I look at it, and as someone who's been in this business now for 18 years, there's an awful lot of sameness to what I see in the marketplace sometimes, and I that's why I like to kind of throw a curveball in my plots and try to kind of push the envelope in terms of what I'm doing in storytelling, and I think that's true in Infinite, and I think you'll see that in I Remember You as well. But would I love to do some other things? Absolutely. I could see myself writing a historical novel at some point. I could see myself potentially doing something YA. I just love different kinds of storytelling. So I don't like to have my my hands tied in any given direction. I like to be able to explore whatever interests me at the time. So yeah, I'm certainly not going to say that I'm set in one particular corridor over the next few years. I'd love to be able to try some new things.
Okay, now we got another question for you. Is it too soon to needle Brian about Frost yet?
Yeah, I do feel bad about Mr. Easton because I know I left The Crooked Street on a bit of a cliffhanger. Feel free to write my Thomas and Mercer editor and give her a hard time here, because I've been pushing going back to Frost for a while now, and they keep saying, "Hell yeah, but we're doing so well with these standalones. When you've got a good thing going, we don't want to mess it up here." So they've been getting just fantastic results with Thief River Falls and Infinite. They've got really high hopes for I Remember You. So they love what we've been doing with the standalone. So it's kind of hard to argue with success. But yeah. I haven't forgotten about Frost. One of these days, I swear I'm going to find a way to get back and rescue him from the dire straits that I put him in. I just can't tell you exactly when that's going to be.
Boy, that is so unfair to leave a character in peril.
I
Shame on
know.
you.
And particularly for someone who's a little OCD like me, it's kind of like saying shaving a haircut without the 2 bits, I mean.
Yeah, boy, I'll say. I mean, there shouldn't be cliffhangers if that's the end.
Well, here's a good question. I don't think you've addressed this yet. Since Stride is aging, will he eventually pass off his duties to another character, similar to what Connolly is doing with Bosch?
Yeah, good question. Well, Stride has pulled off a pretty neat trick over the years. When I first wrote Immoral, the very first Stride novel, Stride was older than me at that point, and now here we are 18 years later, and I'm quite a bit older than Stride. So that's a pretty neat trick that he has pulled off. Yeah, he's getting older. He went through a very severe experience in Funeral for a Friend, and we'll be dealing with the ramifications of that in the Zero Night later this year. Will I completely take Stride out of the picture? I can't quite see that. I mean, I guess I would be more inclined to try to wrap up the series than to remove Stride. But at the same time, with a character getting older, it just means I think you just look for different aspects of storytelling, and he may not be chasing criminals in quite the same way he did, but it just means that he has to approach things in a different way. So at least for the time being, I don't see any need to pass the baton quite yet.
So Stride's not going to become Stagger or Stumble at any time.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah,
keep him in Stride. Let's see here. I think that's about it. You got some great people, great readers and fans watching, and a number of them are just saying how much they love your stuff. And
right, wonderful.
Yeah. Are there any?
That's the part that means so much to me. I mean, I love hearing from readers. I love their emails and seeing the posts they make. I mean, that's what keeps me energized every morning is being able to deliver emotion and drama and excitement to readers. That's
it's so much fun to talk to Brian. I mean, he's so responsive and he's so energetic and all. We always have a great time. Never know exactly where we're going, but
what's
really
the average writing day like for you? You must be very disciplined about getting a certain number of hours or words out there.
Yeah, it's still pretty much a 9-to-5 job for me, and when I'm it varies a little depending on where I am in a book. I mean, the next couple of months I'm basically going to be plotting out the 3 books I'm going to write this year, so I probably won't do much actual writing in February and March. I'm going to be more kind of putting the pieces of stories together, and then I'll dive in as we get toward the springtime. And most days I tend to be kind of blocking out a chapter in the mornings, and then most of the actual writing seems to get done in the afternoons. And then then the next day I start by editing what I did the day before, and that kind of pulls me into the narrative again. So, but I still kind of see it as this is my job. I was in the 9-to-5 world for so long that it still feels pretty natural to approach writing that way too.
Cool. Well, excellent answer, Brian. Well, we'll have an opportunity to talk to Brian more this year, clearly.
Absolutely.
So I will look forward to, I'm pretty sure that we'll hear from Putnam about your July book. So
Yep.
we'll leap ahead to Born and talk about him, and then we'll see where we are. Maybe we'll combine the other 2 into one event, but
great to get you back out.
Publishers all have different requests and different, you just never know for sure. And plus we honestly don't know whether how much travel there's going to be in anybody's future. We don't know
right.
How comfortable people will have with live events. But Zoom has been an absolute godsend during the last couple of years. They've given us a chance to do things that that really would have been impractical or too expensive much of the time for us to be actually doing. So I will tell you that I am looking forward to talking to the First Lady of Iceland about her amazing memoir on February 18th, I think it is. And I will say that is an event we probably never would have done in terms of a live event, but should be really interesting. It will be really interesting because I love the book. I've read it recently, and it's fascinating. she's an immigrant to Ireland. She's Canadian and ended up meeting her husband at Oxford and marrying him. And one of the things I admired about her is that she felt, as an immigrant, obliged to learn Icelandic. And, you know, I'm a believer that people who immigrate into the United States ought to learn to speak English. So, you know, that's an old-fashioned view, but nonetheless,
I hope she doesn't take it against me that in the opening chapter of my next Born book, I'm blowing up quite a few things in Iceland. So
well, she might. She really might. Anyway, you know, Zoom allows us to do these things that I think are completely fascinating. So my own thought is that even when we can go back to live events, we'll still do Zoom events as well. And it'll be interesting to kind of combine the two, see how it works out. Anyway, Brian, thank you so much for spending time.
Thank you.
Stay indoors, do not go outside when it is like minus whatever it is.
Yeah.
And we do have autographed copies of the Ursulina coming our way. So feel free to order one and we'll provide it as soon as they get here. Right? So good night, Brian. Patrick.
Good night.
Once
Night.
again.
Take care. We'll
Yeah.
talk to you soon.
Good evening,
All right.
everybody.